By 7 in the morning, the block of ice inside the wooden box had already lost a corner of itself. Nobody had touched it. Nobody had opened the door more than once. It had simply started to disappear, the way it always did, the way it had to, because that was the deal. Ice did not wait for anyone's convenience. It kept its own schedule, and the only question that mattered on a morning like this one was whether the Iceman's wagon would reach the house before the block reached the bottom of the pan. This was not a modern kitchen, with a machine humming quietly in the corner, holding a steady, indifferent cold, no matter what the sky was doing outside. This was the summer of the 1930s, and inside this house, the cold itself was a resource, purchased, measured, watched. A mother stood in front of the icebox before the rest of the family was even awake, and she was not looking at food. She was reading it. She was doing the math that no one had taught her in school, but that every kitchen in America had taught her without a single word. How many hours of cold were left, and what needed to happen before those hours ran out. The milk came first. It always came first. Milk did not forgive carelessness, and children did not forgive a stomachache that could have been avoided. Then came the meat, set aside that morning, with a plan already built around it, a plan that assumed the ice would hold until supper, then the butter, softening faster than anyone wanted to admit. Then the vegetables from yesterday, already losing the argument against the heat. None of this was dramatic to look at. No one was shouting. No one was panicking. But underneath the quiet, there was a kind of vigilance that modern life has almost entirely forgotten how to perform, because modern life no longer requires it. Today, a refrigerator holds its temperature whether anyone is paying attention or not. It does not care if you forget it exists for 6 hours. It simply keeps working, silently, invisibly, without needing a single person to manage it. In this house, on this particular day, there was no such mercy. The heat outside was already climbing before the family had finished breakfast, and every degree of it worked directly against the mother's plan for the day. It worked against the milk. It worked against the meat set aside for dinner. It worked against the small margin of safety she had built that morning when the ice was still whole and the day still felt manageable. Somewhere down the street, a wagon was making its way from house to house, and everything about the next several hours depended on when it would arrive, and whether the ice it carried would be enough, and whether it would come in time at all. If you are old enough to remember your grandmother talking about the Iceman, or old enough to remember the sound of a delivery truck that was not carrying packages, but carrying cold itself, then you already know this story was not invented for a video. It was lived, in kitchens very much like this one, by women who never once thought of themselves as remarkable for doing it. They simply did what the day required, because the alternative was food going bad before it ever reached the table, and in a house where money for meat did not come easily, spoiled food was not an inconvenience. It was a loss the family could not always afford to absorb. This is not simply a story about an old-fashioned way of keeping food cold. This is a story about what a home used to require from the person running it: attention, judgment, and a kind of constant, quiet calculation that never really stopped, not even for a moment, on a hot day in a decade that did not forgive mistakes. They were poor, some of these families. Many of them, but being poor did not mean being unprepared. It meant learning to read a block of ice the way other people read a clock, and knowing, long before the wagon appeared at the end of the street, exactly how much time was left before the day would decide the fate of dinner without asking permission. The kitchen at this hour was already doing the work that most modern homes have quietly handed over to a machine. The icebox sat in the coolest corner the house had to offer, away from the window, away from the stove, tucked into the kind of shade that a mother learned to notice the way other people notice a clock on the wall. It was not a large piece of furniture, a wooden cabinet lined in tin with a block of ice sitting in a compartment at the top, and everything else arranged beneath it in an order that made sense only if you understood how cold actually moved. Cold sank, heat rose. The coldest air settled downward, over the milk, over whatever needed the most protection, and the mother who ran this kitchen had learned that lesson the same way she had learned most things, not from a book, but from a mistake she had made once and never made again. This morning, the block was smaller than she wanted it to be. She had bought it the day before, a reasonable size for a reasonable price, enough to last through the next delivery if the weather behaved itself. But the weather had not behaved itself. The night had stayed warm long after the sun went down, and the ice had been working since before anyone woke up, quietly losing ground to a heat that did not care about anyone's plans. She opened the door only far enough to see inside, not because she was being dramatic about it, but because every open door was money leaving the house in the form of cold air escaping into a kitchen that was already too warm. This was not a superstition. It was arithmetic. A child left the icebox open a second too long, and a mother's voice would come from another room before the door had even finished swinging shut, not out of anger, but out of a kind of reflex built from knowing exactly what that open door cost. The milk sat where it always sat, in the coldest spot, closest to the ice. It had to last the children through the day, and there was no version of this house where the children went without milk because someone had been careless with a door. She checked it the way she checked most things in that kitchen, not with a thermometer, because there wasn't one, but with a hand against the glass, a quick tilt of the bottle, a habit built from years of learning what safe milk felt like compared to milk that was starting to turn. It was fine, for now. But here is the part nobody likes to admit when they picture this era with a soft, golden kind of nostalgia. For now was not a comfortable phrase. It was a deadline dressed up as reassurance. Everything in that icebox was fine for now, and everything would stop being fine at some point during the day. And the entire job in front of this woman was figuring out which things would fail first, and arranging the day around saving them before they did. The meat was the next concern, and it was a bigger one. It had been set aside the previous evening for that night's dinner, a modest cut, bought with real thought about what the family could afford and what would actually feed everyone at the table. Meat was not something this household treated casually. It represented a decision made in advance, a small negotiation between the grocery money and the week's plans. And once that decision was made, the meat itself became something the mother felt responsible for, in a way that went beyond simply not wanting to waste food. It was proof that the week's budget had worked. If the meat spoiled before dinner, it wasn't just a meal lost. It was an entire plan collapsing, a plan that had already used up the money it needed and could not simply be redone. She moved it, this morning, closer to where the ice still held its strength, tucking it beneath a cloth, angling it in a way that kept it out of any warm air that might slip in when the door opened for something else. This was not paranoia. This was the ordinary attentiveness required of anyone managing food in a house where the cold itself had a ticking clock built into it, a clock nobody could see, but everybody in that kitchen could feel. And this is where the modern kitchen started to forget itself. A refrigerator today does not ask anyone to think about any of this. It holds 38 degrees whether a person is paying attention to it or not, whether the family opens the door once or 40 times, whether the outside temperature climbs into the 90s or drops into the 60s. The machine does not care. It simply keeps working, and because it simply keeps working, an entire category of household knowledge has quietly disappeared. Not because people became lazier or less capable, but because the skill was no longer required. Nobody teaches a child to check milk with the back of their hand anymore, because nobody needs to. Nobody arranges the day around protecting a cut of meat from the heat, because the heat has been solved, permanently, by a hum in the corner of the kitchen that nobody thinks twice about. This is not a criticism of convenience itself. Convenience saved lives. It solved real dangers that real families faced, dangers that sometimes ended in sickness, in spoiled food that a family could not replace, in the quiet dread of watching a hot week threaten everything in the icebox at once. Nobody watching this story should walk away wishing for the return of spoiled milk and lost meat. But something else happened alongside that convenience, something quieter, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before the day moves on. When the machine took over the job of vigilance, the vigilance itself did not simply become unnecessary, it became invisible. It stopped being a skill families passed down, a habit children absorbed by watching their mothers move through a kitchen with quiet, constant awareness. It became, instead, a forgotten muscle, one that an entire culture no longer exercises, because it no longer has to. Back in this particular kitchen, on this particular morning, the vegetables were the next problem. There were greens from 2 days before, already showing the early signs of giving up against the heat. A few potatoes, still solid, still trustworthy, the kind of vegetable that could wait without complaint. Some tomatoes from the small garden out back, softening in a way that meant they had maybe a day left before they crossed from ripe into something closer to ruined. None of this was waste yet. But all of it was on a schedule, and the mother's job, without anyone ever calling it a job, was to read that schedule accurately enough to use everything before it expired, and to build the day's meals not around what she wanted to cook, but around what the kitchen itself was quietly demanding she use first. This is where the story stops being nostalgic and starts becoming uncomfortable, because it reveals something about scarcity that modern life rarely has to confront directly, when resources are limited and cannot simply be replaced with a trip to the store or a tap on a screen. The person managing a household develops a kind of literacy that has almost nothing to do with recipes and almost everything to do with timing. She was not simply cooking, she was triaging, deciding, hour by hour, what needed rescuing first. By mid-morning, the heat outside had already made its intentions clear. It was going to be one of those days that pressed down on everything, the kind where the air itself seemed to slow down, where even the shade offered less relief than usual, and where every task in the house felt a little heavier because of it. The children had been sent to fetch water, a small chore that doubled as a way of keeping them occupied and out from underfoot, while their mother worked through her mental list of what needed attention. Somewhere in the back of her mind, alongside the milk and the meat and the softening tomatoes, sat one more calculation, quieter than the rest but no less important. When would the ice wagon come, and would it come in time? This was not a small question in a house like this one. The ice itself had been purchased that morning with a specific amount of money, an amount that had to stretch across the rest of the week, not just this one hot afternoon. Buying too much ice meant spending money the family could not easily spare. Buying too little meant risking exactly the kind of loss she was trying to prevent all morning: spoiled milk, ruined meat, an afternoon's work undone by a few extra degrees of heat nobody could control. There was no gauge for this, no dial to check. Only a mother's memory of other hot summers, other bad stretches of weather, other days when the ice had run thinner than expected and she had learned, the hard way, exactly how much margin she needed to build into her morning decisions. That kind of knowledge did not come from a manual. It came from having been wrong before, and having paid for it, and having decided never to be wrong in quite that same way again. Down the street, faintly, there was the sound of wheels on the road, and for a moment, the whole kitchen seemed to pause around it. It might be the ice wagon, it might not be. But everything about the next hour of this family's day depended on which one it turned out to be. It was the wagon. The horse moved at its usual unhurried pace, and the iceman climbed down the same way he did every route, every day, hauling a block from the back with a pair of tongs that had worn smooth from years of the same grip. There was no ceremony to any of this. It was simply how the neighborhood ran, the same way the milkman ran his route, the same way the ragman came through on his own schedule, each of them a small, dependable thread in a system that kept the household functioning without anyone needing to think of it as a system at all. The mother met him at the door with the exact amount of money she had set aside that morning, no more and no less, because there was no more to give, and she had already decided, before he ever arrived, exactly how much ice this day required. This was its own quiet skill, one she had built the same way she had built everything else in that kitchen, by getting it wrong once, buying too little on a day very much like this one, and watching the afternoon punish her for the mistake. He hauled the block through the house, careful not to drip across the floor she had just finished sweeping, and settled it into the compartment above the food it was meant to protect. A few words passed between them about the heat, about how much worse it seemed than the week before, about a house 2 streets over, where the ice had apparently run out entirely the previous afternoon, forcing the family there to eat everything at once, before it spoiled, rather than lose it outright. It was said almost casually, the way people mention bad luck that has not yet become their own, but the mother listening to it filed the detail away all the same, another small data point in the calculation she was always running. He left as unremarkably as he'd arrived, the wagon creaking off toward the next house on the route, and the kitchen returned to its version of normal, except that normal, on a day like this one, meant the entire clock had simply been reset rather than stopped. New ice did not mean the danger was gone. It meant the danger had been pushed back by a few hours, and those hours still needed to be used wisely, because heat like this did not respect anyone's schedule and gave no guarantees about how long even fresh ice would actually hold. This is where the discomfort of the whole system becomes clear, and it's worth sitting with rather than rushing past. The arrival of the ice was not a resolution. It was a reprieve. The mother did not exhale and relax, the way a modern person might exhale after topping off a car with gas, confident the tank would simply do its job until the next fill-up, with no further thought required. She had to keep working the problem, because a hotter day than expected could still outrun even a fresh block, and she had seen it happen before, to her own kitchen and to others. By late morning, she had made her decisions. The tomatoes, softening faster than anything else, would not survive until dinner in any form worth eating, so they became lunch instead, sliced and salted, eaten plainly at the table with whatever bread was left from the day before, a meal that asked for almost nothing beyond the ingredients that were already threatening to go to waste. This was not creativity for its own sake. It was triage dressed up as a meal, the kind of quiet resourcefulness that never announced itself as clever, because in that kitchen, it wasn't considered clever. It was simply what you did. The greens went next, cooked down that same morning rather than held for the evening meal, because greens did not wait politely the way potatoes did, and there was no version of the day where she could afford to lose them to the heat, out of stubbornness, about which meal they were originally intended for. A pot went on the stove, and for a few minutes, the kitchen grew even warmer than it already was. An uncomfortable trade the mother made without complaint, because the alternative, losing food the family had already paid for, was worse than a few extra minutes of heat near the stove. The meat, still the evening's centerpiece, stayed exactly where she had positioned it that morning, close to the strongest cold the icebox could offer, checked again with the same instinctive gesture she'd used at dawn. It was holding, for now. That phrase again, quietly doing its work in the back of her mind, refusing to let her relax completely, even as the morning's most urgent problems resolved themselves one at a time. Outside, the children had returned with the water, sweating from the short walk, and the heat had climbed further still, pressing against the windows, seeping in around the edges of a house that had no real defense against it beyond shade, open windows in the coolest hours, and the stubborn discipline of a mother who refused to let the day get ahead of her. She did not know yet that the afternoon would take even that discipline and test it further. She only knew, standing in her kitchen at midday, that she had made it through the morning without losing anything that could not be replaced, and that the heat outside showed no sign of easing before evening. The ice had been refreshed. The most urgent food had been used. The meat was holding. For a household with no machine to do this thinking for her, that was not a small accomplishment. It was the entire job, done well, one decision at a time, with nothing to show for it except a family that would eat that evening without anyone ever knowing how close the day had come to going differently. By early afternoon, the day had stopped behaving the way she expected it to. The heat had not simply continued climbing at the pace it had set that morning. It had accelerated the way summer afternoons sometimes do, arriving at a kind of heaviness that pressed into every room of the house at once, the kind of heat that made the air itself feel like something you had to push through rather than simply breathe. The windows were open as far as they could go, and it made no difference. There was no breeze coming through them, only warmth, moving in slow, thick waves that seemed to settle into every corner of the kitchen and refuse to leave. She checked the icebox again, earlier than she normally would have, because something in the wait of the afternoon told her not to wait for her usual rhythm. The block was smaller than it should have been, not shockingly so, not something a stranger walking through the kitchen would have noticed at a glance, but she was not a stranger to this icebox. She knew its rhythms the way she knew the sound of her own children's footsteps on the stairs, and what she saw was a block of ice losing ground faster than the morning's math had accounted for. This is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath every graceful old photograph of a woman standing calmly in a 1930s kitchen. The plan was never guaranteed. A morning's careful calculation could be undone by an afternoon that simply refused to cooperate. And when that happened, there was no customer service line to call, no emergency delivery to request, no way to summon more cold out of thin air. There was only the mother, the food in front of her, and the choice of what to do next. She opened the door fully this time because she needed to see everything at once, not in careful glimpses, but laid out entirely, the way a person assesses a situation that has just changed shape on them. The milk, still safe but with less margin than she wanted. The meat, the one piece of the day's plan she had protected most carefully, sitting exactly where she had left it, still cold to the touch, but no longer holding the deep chill it had that morning. The butter had softened past the point of pretending otherwise, sitting in its dish with the slightly glossy look that meant it had crossed from firm to something closer to spreadable, whether anyone wanted it to or not. And the greens she had not used that morning, the ones she had been saving for the evening meal, had wilted further than she'd planned for, their color dulling in a way that told her, without needing to be told twice, that tonight was the last night they would be good for anything at all. She stood there for a moment, doing the math one more time, the same math she had been doing all day, but now with a different, sharper urgency behind it. Dinner had been planned for the evening, the usual hour, the usual rhythm the family followed every day of the week. But the ice in front of her was not going to hold that plan. If she waited until the evening the way the day had originally been arranged, she risked losing the meat entirely, turning a carefully budgeted cut into something inedible, into a loss the family's grocery money could not simply absorb without consequence. The evening meal, in other words, was going to have to become the afternoon meal, whether anyone in the house was ready for that or not. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into the soft, nostalgic version of this era, and it deserves to be said plainly. This was not a charming inconvenience. This was a woman recalculating an entire day's plan in the space of a few minutes because the weather had made a decision for her, and the only thing left to decide was how well she would respond to it. She called the children in from outside. There was no dramatic announcement, no explanation beyond what needed to be said. Dinner was happening now, earlier than usual, and there was work to do before it did. The children, used to a household that ran on rhythms they didn't always understand, but had learned not to question, came inside without much protest, sensing without being told that something about the day had shifted. The meat went onto the stove first, because it was the piece of the meal that could not wait any longer and could not be salvaged in any other form if it slipped past its final window. She prepared it simply, the way most weeknight meals in that kitchen were prepared, without unnecessary flourish, because flourish was not the point. The point was using what she had, in the time she had, before the day took it away from her entirely. The greens went in next, the ones that had wilted further than planned, cooked down until their toughness softened into something the family would still recognize as food worth eating, even if it wasn't the crisp, bright version they might have had a day earlier. This is where the old kitchen's real intelligence showed itself most clearly, not in some elaborate trick, but in the simple, practiced ability to look at food that was past its best moment and see, immediately, what it could still become rather than what it had already stopped being. The tomatoes from the garden, softer now than even the ones she'd used at lunch, went in as well, cooked down into something closer to a sauce than a salad. Their decline turned into an asset rather than treated as a loss. The butter, too soft to hold its shape on a plate, the way it might on a cooler day, got folded into the vegetables instead. Its texture no longer a problem once it had a purpose beyond simply sitting on the table looking presentable. None of this was improvisation in the modern sense of the word, the kind that gets praised on a cooking show for its cleverness. It was closer to necessity wearing the appearance of skill, the kind of resourcefulness that a household developed not because anyone wanted to be resourceful, but because the alternative was watching food disappear into waste that the family's budget simply could not tolerate. But here is the part nobody likes to admit. Underneath the calm, practiced motion of this kitchen, there was real pressure. A mother pulling together an early dinner out of softening vegetables and a threatened cut of meat was not performing some folksy version of thrift for anyone's benefit. She was managing real stakes. If this meal failed, if the meat had already turned before she caught it, if the vegetables had crossed too far into spoilage to be saved, the family would eat less well that evening, and the money already spent on that food would simply be gone, with nothing to show for it, and no easy way to make up the difference before the next payday. This is where the modern comparison becomes unavoidable, and it's worth sitting with honestly, rather than turning it into a simple story of the past being better than the present. Today, a family facing a similar problem, a refrigerator running warm, food close to spoiling, has options that this household did not have. A phone call, a delivery order, a quick trip to a store open at any hour, stocked with replacements for nearly anything that goes wrong in a kitchen. That safety net is real, and it has genuinely made modern life safer, less precarious, less dependent on a single person's vigilance, holding up under pressure. But that safety net also means an entire skill has quietly atrophied across generations, the specific skill this mother was using without even thinking of it as a skill, the ability to look at food that is failing and see, immediately and without panic, exactly what it can still become. Modern kitchens are, in many ways, more forgiving than this one ever was. But that forgiveness came at a cost that rarely gets mentioned, and the cost was this particular kind of quiet, practical intelligence, the kind that doesn't announce itself, doesn't ask for recognition, and simply gets the job done, under pressure that most modern households will never have to feel in quite the same way. The meal came together faster than any of the children fully understood, and by the time they sat down at the table, the sun still high, the heat still pressing against the windows, there was a full plate in front of each of them. Meat, cooked simply but properly. Greens, softened into something warm and satisfying, despite having been on the edge of spoiling only an hour before. Tomatoes, cooked down into a sauce that tasted, if anything, richer than they might have raw. Bread from the day before, still good enough to serve its purpose. Nobody at that table knew, or needed to know, how close the afternoon had come to a different outcome. To them, it was simply dinner, a little earlier than usual, on a hot day, that had made everyone a little more tired than most. They ate the way children eat when they are hungry and the food in front of them is good, without pausing to consider what it had taken to get there. Their mother ate more slowly, the way people eat after a task has finally been completed rather than before one begins, the particular tiredness of having managed something correctly settling into her shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. And this is where the story stops being simply about ice and meat and softening vegetables, and starts being about something larger, something that sat underneath every hot day in a house like this one. The mother at this table had not done anything dramatic. She had not solved a crisis in any way that would make for an exciting tale told at a neighborhood gathering. She had simply paid close, constant attention to a system that had no room for carelessness, and she had adjusted, hour by hour, as that system changed shape on her, until the day ended with a family fed and nothing lost that could not be replaced. That same discipline appeared in another corner of the house that afternoon too, though nobody thought to name it as such. The children, sweating through the hottest part of the day, drank the water they had fetched that morning without complaint, understanding, without being told, that complaining about the heat did not make the ice last any longer or the day move any faster. That too was a Depression-era lesson, quieter than the one in the kitchen but no less real. The household did not have the luxury of everyone managing their own discomfort loudly. There was only so much attention to go around, and the mother's attention that day belonged to the food, because the food was what stood between the family and a harder week than the one they were already living through. By late afternoon, with the meal finished and the dishes washed in water that had to be used carefully, given how hard the family's small well was working in this heat, the kitchen finally settled into something resembling quiet. The icebox held what was left of the day's ice, enough now to see the family through to evening without the same urgency that had driven the last several hours. The mother allowed herself, finally, a moment of stillness, standing near the window where whatever breeze existed might reach her, the heat of the stove and the heat of the day both finally beginning to loosen their grip. She had not thought of herself, at any point that day, as doing anything remarkable. She would not have described her own morning and afternoon as an accomplishment worth mentioning to anyone outside the house. But what she had done, without ceremony, without recognition, without a single modern convenience to lean on, was hold an entire household's food supply together through a day that had tried, more than once, to take it apart. She had read a block of ice the way another generation might read a stock ticker or a weather app, constantly, instinctively, adjusting every plan she had made that morning to match a reality that refused to stay still. And somewhere between convenience and the quiet disappearance of this kind of attention, the modern home lost something it still hasn't quite found a replacement for. Not the ice itself. Nobody is nostalgic for spoiled milk or lost meat, or the real fear that came with genuinely limited resources. What was lost was the muscle behind the vigilance, the specific, practiced way of looking at a kitchen and knowing, without needing a manual or a machine to tell you, exactly what needed saving first. If you grew up in a house shaped by a mother or grandmother who lived through years like this one, you may recognize pieces of this story, even if you never once thought about where they came from. The way your own mother checked the milk before pouring it, out of habit rather than doubt. The way she never let a door stay open a second longer than it needed to. The way she could look at a bowl of vegetables past their best day and see dinner instead of waste, without a recipe, without hesitation, as though the decision had already been made somewhere long before she ever stood in that kitchen. None of that was random. It was inherited, a skill passed down not through instruction, but through years of quiet demonstration, absorbed by children who often didn't understand what they were watching until decades later, standing in their own kitchens, hearing their mother's voice in their own head, telling them not to leave that door open. It is worth remembering, too, that this particular day, as ordinary as it might sound described this plainly, was not without real risk. A family in this era did not have a cushion built for mistakes. A ruined dinner was not simply an inconvenience to laugh about later. It was money spent without return, a week's careful budget thrown off by a single afternoon of bad luck or bad judgment. And for some families, a mistake like this one compounded into something more serious than a single bad meal. This is not a story that should be romanticized into something quaint or charming. It is a story about a woman managing real consequences with real stakes, using nothing but attention, memory, and a stubborn refusal to let the heat win. By the time evening arrived, the household had settled into the version of calm that that came only after a day like this one had finally been won. The children, fed and tired from the heat, drifted toward whatever rest the evening allowed. The kitchen, its urgent work behind it for another day, sat quiet in a way it hadn't managed since before dawn. And the mother, still moving through the house with the same quiet attentiveness that had carried her through every hour since morning, understood, in the way people understand things they never say out loud, that tomorrow would very likely ask the same thing of her all over again. That was the reality underneath every hot day in a house like this one. There was no permanent victory over the heat, no single decision that solved the problem for good. There was only the next day and the one after that, each of them requiring the same close attention, the same willingness to adjust a plan the moment it stopped working, the same refusal to let carelessness cost the family something it could not afford to lose. It was not a dramatic kind of strength. It rarely looked like anything at all from the outside, but it held an entire household together, one hot afternoon at a time, in a way that a modern kitchen, humming quietly and reliably in the background, no longer requires from anyone. There was no dramatic ending to that day, no moment where anyone stood back and declared it a victory. The sun went down, the way it always did, the heat finally loosened its grip toward evening, and a family that had come dangerously close to losing part of its dinner simply went to bed, unaware of how much quiet skill had stood between them and a very different night. That is the part of this story worth sitting with. This was never really about a block of ice. It was about a woman who understood a system nobody had written down for her, who read food the way other people read a face, who knew, hour by hour, exactly what needed protecting and what needed using before it was too late. She did not have a machine to trust. She had attention, memory, and a household that depended entirely on her getting it right, day after day, in a decade that offered very little room for mistakes. The Depression years were not gentle. Families went without. Money ran short in ways that shaped entire childhoods. Nobody watching this should walk away thinking there was anything easy or romantic about a mother having to gamble the week's meat against the weather. But inside that hardship, there was a kind of intelligence that modern homes rarely need anymore, and it is worth remembering, not because we should wish the hardship back, but because the skill it built deserves more credit than it usually gets. Think about what actually happened in that kitchen, stripped of all its period detail. A resource ran out faster than expected. A plan built that morning stopped working by afternoon, and instead of panic, instead of loss, there was a recalculation, made quickly, made correctly, using nothing but attention and the accumulated memory of every other hot day that had come before it. That is not a small thing. That is the exact kind of steadiness that gets a family through hard years, one ordinary afternoon at a time, without anyone ever calling it heroic. If you grew up watching a mother, a father, or a grandmother move through a kitchen with that same quiet, constant attention, you were watching something that came from somewhere. It came from summers like this one, from hot afternoons that had no forgiveness built into them, from a generation that learned to read a block of ice the way we read a clock, because the alternative was losing something the family could not simply replace. They were poor, some of them, many of them, but they were not helpless. And whatever they knew, they carried into the decades that followed, into the kitchens their children grew up in, into habits that outlived the icebox itself by a long, long time. Long after the ice truck stopped running down American streets, that same watchfulness stayed in the hands of the people who had learned it. It showed up in a mother in the 1950s who still checked her new refrigerator out of old habit, still hesitant to trust a machine the way she trusted her own hands. It showed up in a grandmother in the 1960s who still couldn't bring herself to throw away a vegetable that had a little life left in it, even with a working freezer standing right beside her. The tool changed. The instinct did not. And for a lot of families, that instinct is the real inheritance, quieter than any recipe, sturdier than any object passed down in a drawer. If this brought back a memory of your own mother, father, or grandmother, subscribe to the Depression-era home, like this video, and tell us in the comments what it was like in your house before the refrigerator did all the thinking for everyone. Maybe it was the sound of the ice truck coming down your street. Maybe it was a grandmother who never let a door stay open. Maybe it was a parent who could look at a wilting vegetable and see dinner instead of waste. Whatever it is, share it here and share this video with someone who might remember it too. Your memory could be exactly the thing that helps someone else remember theirs.